My name is Erica Lemberger, and welcome to the Human Trafficking and Retail Health, What Nurse Practitioners Need to Know About the Identification, Assessment, and Referral of Victims. If you haven't already completed the pretest, I would ask that you do. Here's the link to the pretest. I don't believe you're able to click on the link if you're watching this on video or on YouTube, but if you can type it into your browser, complete the pretest, and then we can watch this presentation, and afterwards there is a post-test. I would strongly encourage you to complete the post-test. This is part of my Doctor of Nursing Practice project, in addition to being some really great information. So here's the pretest, and let's get started. My name is Erica Lemberger. I'm a board-certified family nurse practitioner and Doctorate of Nursing Practice student at Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. With almost 20 years of healthcare experience, I have worked in a variety of areas as a nurse practitioner, including retail health, private primary care, military health, the emergency department, and pediatric forensics. In addition to my doctoral studies, I am currently employed full-time and provide care to pregnant and parenting teenagers in a public high school. I was formerly employed by a large retail health organization, and I am the first and am the only family nurse practitioner in the state of Kentucky who's also a certified forensic nurse and board-certified sexual assault nurse examiner for adults, adolescents, and children. I've collaborated with law enforcement, child protective services, professionals in the legal profession, and nonprofit agencies related to human trafficking. I regularly attend local human trafficking task force meetings, and I'm currently serving on the Mayor's Racism Task Force. This presentation on human trafficking and retail health is one part of my evidence-based change project for my doctorate in nursing practice degree. So I once again would like to strongly encourage you to complete the pre-testing and especially the post-testing part of this presentation. And with that, let's get started. Here are the objectives. You can read the objectives over to yourself, but basically what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to give you a good overview and a good definition of what human trafficking is and what it's not. Then we're going to go over why human trafficking is so important to identify in the retail health setting. And then we're going to go over how to identify, how to assess, and how to refer victims of human trafficking. So what is human trafficking? A lot of people say, I have no idea what it is. I've heard about it in the news, I've heard about it in CEU classes, but I really have no idea what it is. Well, human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery. So what we're dealing with here is people who are bought and sold for either the purposes of sex or for labor, for work. And we can have both foreign and domestic victims. And so someone can be born in the United States, meaning that they're domestic, or they can come from another country into the United States, which would be called a foreign native victim. But it's both a problem internationally and here in the United States. Human trafficking is a federal crime punishable by jail time for both the trafficker and for the buyer, hopefully not for the victim. We're trying to get away from punishing the victims with jail time. But there are state laws and federal laws that both govern over human trafficking. It is a huge problem here in the United States. About half the victims that are being trafficked are domestic victims. So that means that they were born here in the United States and that they're continuing to be trafficked. And half of them were born in other countries and they were brought here into the United States. One of the things I'd like to bring to your attention is I am going to mention some statistics. I am going to mention some numbers throughout this presentation. And I want you to recognize that they're kind of ballpark estimates because there are not many quantitative studies on victims. There's very few United States specific studies, and a lot of the studies that we have small sample sizes. We actually need more research in this area. So the numbers I'm going to give to you are the best estimates of what we have. It's actually probably a more significant problem than what we estimate it to be. It's probably a more severe problem than what we estimate it to be. We do know that the number of people who are being trafficked, or as I like to say, enslaved, in today's world, that it's actually a lot larger than than the number of people that were enslaved during the transatlantic African slave trade. So it's a really big problem. What is human trafficking? Well, like I said, there are federal anti-trafficking laws that were put in place in 2000, and they've been renewed every year since then. Trafficking, it can either be two forms. There's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And this is one of the few times I'm going to read the slide to you. Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, or provision of obtaining a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So what does that mean? What that means is we're going to have Part A and then Part B. So Part A is the Commercial Sex Act, and Part B would be the force, fraud, or coercion. So when you see someone or an activity that you think is a commercial sex act, then you begin to look and see, is there force or fraud or coercion, one of the three. Or if the person looks like they're under 18, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. You can just have the Commercial Sex Act. The person's under 18, whether they're 17, 15, 4, 3, 2, 1, then it would still be considered sex trafficking, which is a form of human trafficking. Then you have labor trafficking, which is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services, so that's working, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjectation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. So basically someone is being forced, either through force, fraud, or coercion, to work. So when we talk about sex trafficking, I want you to understand that it's not necessarily sex, meaning intercourse. It's a commercial sex act. There can be a lot of different kinds of commercial sex acts. That could be pornography. That could be escort services. That could be stripping. That could be intercourse or other sex acts. So those are all commercial sexual acts. And the exchange does not have to involve money. You can have sex in exchange for money, but you can also have stripping in exchange for a house. Or you can have pornography in exchange for really fancy clothes or really fancy jewelry or something like that. Or you can have sex for shelter, sex for food, sex to survive, basic needs. And all of that is still forms of human trafficking if there's force, fraud, or coercion, or if the person is under 18. And with labor trafficking, it could also be the same thing. It could be labor in exchange for not necessarily it doesn't have, you would have to be able to show force, fraud, or coercion. Okay. So you might be saying, okay, I understand that this is a big problem. I understand this is a problem here in the United States, but why should I care? Well, right now we know that it's an estimated $32 billion problem internationally. Right now it's tied with the arms trade, with the sale of guns, as the number 2 most common criminal industry in the world. It's soon going to pass the sale of drugs to become the number 1 criminal industry in the world. So when we think about gangs and we think about the sale of guns and the sale of drugs, we really should be thinking about the sale of people or the rental of people. And why is that? I'm asked all the time, really, are you sure it's such a big problem? I can't believe it's really number 2. It's going to be number 1. How could that be? And this is my answer to that. When you have someone and they sell drugs, they have their cocaine or their heroin or whatever their substance is, they get their supply and they sell it, and that drug is gone. They have to go get more supply and sell it again. But with human trafficking, it's rental. They're basically selling that person over and over and over. They're renting them out and taking them back and selling them over and over and over for either a commercial sex act or for labor. And so the criminal, the trafficker, or the abuser gets to hold on to that person and can make a lot of money. Another reason why this is it's more popular for traffickers to traffic people instead of selling drugs or selling guns is because there's less sentencing. The court system hasn't caught up as quickly with sentences. So unfortunately right now, if you were to go up for a drug crime, you might get a higher punishment than if you got one up to the court for a human trafficking crime. And there's also less surveillance from the police. We've been doing more and more education with law enforcement, but the law enforcement's hanging out in the poor side of towns, or they're hanging out the seedier hotels, not where human trafficking is happening. We have to remember that people who are buying people, they have to have money. And so this is going to happen in really nice ends of town. It's also going to happen in poor ends of town. It's going to happen all over, but people have to have money in order to buy people. Okay. The next question I'm often asked is, what is the difference between prostitution and human trafficking? What is the difference between working and being labor trafficked? And this is the way I answer that. A lot of my students, my high school students, they work in fast food restaurants. They hate their jobs, they hate their managers. The managers tell them what to do, they're on their feet all the time, they hate the greasy food, they hate the hairnets. But the difference between being labor trafficked and just having a job is my students can quit when they want to. If you're being trafficked, you can't quit. In fast food, if you are being paid for your services, you know that you have laws that protect you. You know you're going to get a minimum wage, you know you're going to receive your paycheck, you know you're going to receive the money that is adequate for the time that you work. But in human trafficking, you work, you cannot quit if you want to, and there are no laws to protect you, and often you're not being given the money. The trafficker or the pimp is being given the money. So you might understand that it's a big problem. Human trafficking is a big problem. It's a big problem here in the United States. You might understand what human trafficking is, but why should I care? I work in a retail health center. What does this have to do with me? Well, we know that at least 25% of survivors who have been interviewed have reported seeing a healthcare provider within the last 6 months while they were in captivity. So we know that they're seeking out healthcare services, either for illness or injury that might be related to their being trafficked. It might just not. It might be a child who just has a regular childhood illness, and the trafficker might seek out care for that child or for that person, for that teenager. And retail health centers are doing really well. We know that they provide really convenient care. It's very affordable. There's great name recognition. They're easy to find. You know that if you go to one, that there's probably going to be other retail health centers somewhere in the near vicinity. You might be able to find them in other states as well. And we know that retail health centers provide really competent care. We also know that in emergency rooms, where some of the education has been done to identify victims of human trafficking, there's a lot of people in emergency rooms. You have social workers and physicians and nurse practitioners and nurses, EEG techs, respiratory therapists, radiology techs, there's secretaries, there's all kinds of people in an emergency room. But in a retail health center, often it's just the one provider, usually a nurse practitioner, sometimes a physician assistant or otherwise. And sometimes there's a front office person, but there's not as many people to recognize that victim. And so they are able to go under the radar, and traffickers know this. And traffickers might seek out health care in a retail health center because of that. So we have to be just as savvy in knowing how to identify, assess, and refer these victims. So like I said, when it comes to either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, we need, in order to recruit a person, you're going to need either force, fraud, or coercion. You only need one. You don't need force and fraud and coercion. You just need one of them. Force is just what it sounds like. It's a physical or sexual abuse. It's basically using physical force to get someone to do what they want. It's not the most common form of control, but it is used. More often, there is fraud and coercion, sometimes a blending of the two. So let's move on to the next. These are some statistics about human trafficking. The average teenager is 12 to 14 years of age when they enter into the sex trade, and that is a staggering statistic. We know that 1 in 7 teenagers in the U.S. runs away from home. We know that we have 1.3 to 2.8 million runaways in this country, and we know that 1 in 3 teens are lured into prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. The longer they are gone, the longer they are to engage in survival sex. We know that 90% of children turn to survival sex within 3 months after running away from home. And those statistics are from the National Incidence Study of Missing, Runaway, and Throwaway Children in 2008. So we know that this is going to be a big deal, and we know that I used to work in retail health. I know I saw a lot of adolescents. I saw adolescents coming in for sports physicals, I saw adolescents coming in for flu shots, and I saw adolescents coming in for otitis, strep throat, UTI, other kinds of issues. I'm going to tell you that more often there are 70% female and half are children, but I will say there are not that many studies on boys. Boys also don't often self-identify themselves as victims. They're more likely to identify themselves as hustlers than a victim. And so we know that there are a lot of females, but I am kind of inclined to say that there's probably a lot of boys as well. Half are children. Here in Kentucky, we actually have 56% children. Of the 56% of the victims that we've identified so far have been children, so we're a little bit higher than the national average. Between 14,500 and 17,500 people are trafficked into the U.S. each year, but like I said, that might only account for a small number of the people who are being trafficked here in this country. It's estimated on a daily basis that there are an estimated 300,000 children in the United States that are at risk for being trafficked each year. So that's not the number of people who are being trafficked or children who are being trafficked. It's the number who are at risk, but it is a big problem. So where is this happening? Where is this happening? This website, this is from the Polaris Project, and this kind of gives you an overview of the hot spots of where this is happening. You can basically see that it's happening in all 50 states. And here, this is another interactive map that comes from the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project I'll mention in your resources. It's a wonderful nonprofit organization that works to help victims of human trafficking. And you can click on your own state and you can see what the incidence and prevalence and what the issues are in your own state if you go to their website. This was an actual page from the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When I was developing this presentation, I went to the website to see what was going on in terms of trends on human trafficking. And what I noticed were these are just some articles that were on the front page, and it talks about Rochester, Houston, Chicago, North Carolina, Visalia, which is in California, Milwaukee. Basically, human trafficking is happening everywhere. So I wanted to just pull that off an actual website, not a research article, and show you that that's actually happening. Okay, so when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, here you have fraud. Fraud are basically false promises of a better life. And so what does that look like? That looks like this. That looks like you might have a trafficker who finds someone, and they live in another country, and they want to come to the United States, but they have no ability to pay. They have no financial means. So the traffickers say, hey, you know what? I'll bring you to the United States. But once they get to the United States, I'll take care of everything. I'll take care of your visa. I'll take care of all of the legal paperwork. I'll take care of everything, and I'll bring you here, and I'll give you a much better life than what you have. You live in whatever country it is. I'm going to bring you here. I'm going to give you a great life. And once they get here, they take away their passport. They don't pay them. And the person is afraid to speak up. Why are they afraid? They might be afraid because they might think that they're going to be deported. They might think that the police were being paid off, because in a lot of people's countries that aren't in the United States, you can pay the police as hush money. And so they might be thinking that the police won't be able to help them. Or they might have heard stories of the police not coming to help them. Or they don't know their basic rights. Or they're out of their own country. Or they don't speak the language. And suddenly they're more vulnerable. So it's a promise. Or you might see in sex trafficking, you might have an older boyfriend and a younger girl, and he might say, hey, you know what, things are really rough at home. The girl might be sexually abused at home. We know a lot of our girls, a lot of our victims have been sexually abused before they enter into the sex trade. And so they might say, you know, I know you have a really bad life situation. I know that you're witnessing a lot of domestic violence, although they might not say it that way. But I know you have it really rough. Why don't you let me take care of you? Why don't you let me take you on a shopping spree? Why don't you let me take care of you? Why don't you come and stay with me? And so they make them promises of a better life or a better job. And he might say, you know, I'll be the family that you never had. I'll take care of you. And then within time, he begins to rape the patient, the student, or the victim. And then they'll start to sell them for sex. And now that victim is separated from their family, and they're too afraid to leave their trafficker, and they're really stuck. The other part of the fraud and the promise that I should have mentioned is that because we know that our victims who are being trafficked, if it's labor trafficking, they're not getting the money. And so one case locally that came up, which was, I thought, a really good example, it was someone who was working in a Chinese food restaurant. And you know, you can go to the Chinese food restaurants and it's like $5 all you can eat. And you're like, well, how do they even make money off that? Well, I'm not saying all restaurants do it, but sometimes it's through human trafficking, getting people to work for not that many wages. And there was one case where the trafficker actually kept records, and there was an $80,000 debt that this person had owed them. What they basically do is they bring them into the country and they say, you know what, you have to work for us because we worked so hard to bring you here, or we have to work for us because we offered you all this food and shelter, and we've offered you clothes and all of this. You have to work to pay down your debt. And that one, the trafficker actually he saved his records, and it was like $80,000. There was no way that that person was ever going to pay off that debt working in a Chinese food restaurant. So the next form of control is coercion, and that is restraint of any person, any scheme, any plan or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm. So this is actually very, 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 very common. And what it's looked like, it's used to threaten or shame. So if you have someone who is a foreign native and they've come to this country, it's if you don't do what I say, I'll call the police. If you don't do what I say, I'll call immigration. Or if you don't do what I say, it might be a young child, I'll hurt your family members. I know where your family lives, and I'm going to go to your house next week. Or it might say, I'm going to get the debt that you owe, and I'm going to go and get it from your family. Or it might sound like, don't talk back to me. Do you see what happened to another person? Or it can look like a threat that's told to the victim, but it's used to control them. And all you need is force, fraud, or coercion. You don't need all three. There's different pathways to entry. We know that there's usually violence in the home, and then when it comes to sex trafficking, it's usually that the person is coming from a home where there's something going on in that home, and all of a sudden someone pays attention to them and they're seduced into another life. And what that might look like with the sex trafficker is he approaches a girl and he says, hey, you know, do you want to come to my club? You don't have to strip, you don't have to have sex. Why don't you just serve drinks? And so she's told that all she has to do is serve drinks. And then she's serving drinks, and then he's like, you know, you're doing so well with that one night. Why don't you get up on stage? Why don't you strip? And so then she starts stripping, and one thing leads to another, and the next thing you know, she's having sex in exchange for money, and she cannot leave, and she's having sex with multiple people in one evening. And teens are a lot more vulnerable. They're often lured into the life through advertisement or through photographs. You might hear on the radio, oh, modeling agency, or are you ready to get your life started to add to your portfolio? Or there might be blackmail in order to get people to do what they want. Often with teens, there's traffickers, and they hang out and they try to recruit students. So they might get one student to recruit another student in a community center or in a high school or within networks. And so there's a lot of different pathways to entry, but these traffickers are very smart. Sometimes it's not just a male trafficker. Sometimes it is a female trafficker. Sometimes it's a parent trafficking their own child. We know that parents traffic their own children. What that usually looks like is a parent who has a drug problem, and the drug trafficker comes to the house, says, you know what, you need to pay me for the drugs, and the parent says, you know what, I don't have the money to pay you for the drugs, but I have my 10-year-old daughter, I'll rent out my 10-year-old daughter for 2 hours, please don't hurt me, just take my daughter for 2 hours and return her. And that is trafficking. That is drugs in exchange for a commercial sex act. And so we know that that happens. We also know that traffickers often have one victim, which it's usually a female, and they call them the bottom bitch, and they get the bottom bitch to go and recruit other people. And she's kind of like the trafficker's right-hand woman. And so there are many different pathways to entry. Like I said, boys, there's not that much literature on boys. There's very few articles, but we know that boys are being trafficked probably just as much as girls. So CSA. CSA is commercial sexual exploitation of children. We know that children are being exploited, and we know that about 90% of child victims have a history of sexual abuse before entering into the sex trade. We also know that a lot of them have had experience with the child welfare or foster care system, which puts them in an even more vulnerable state. So with children, you have to understand that it's not just sex, it's also child porn. Child porn is a form of child sexual exploitation. False promises for modeling or TV work. And as I mentioned, parents traffic their kids. It used to be that we would see a lot of girls running from trucks, from the semi-trucks, from one stop to another. But that has since declined a little bit, but certainly truck stops are a very common way of trafficking children. And you can't ever really look at a child and say that they'll never be a victim. Any child can be a victim. And any child that we see in the retail health setting, we should really have it on our radar in terms of have it in the back of our mind, could this child be a victim? So the question next is, what is it going to look like? When I'm in my retail health center, what am I going to look like? One thing that I'm going to tell you is that most victims are not going to openly disclose to a healthcare provider that they're being trafficked. So if you have someone in your clinic and you're kind of suspecting and you say, you know what, are you a prostitute or are you being trafficked? Neither of those are really going to work. The way that we use to describe the life of human trafficking is we say in the life. And so if you use terminology that is kind of used by people who are in the life, it's more likely that you'll get a disclosure. You might notice that there's some controlling behaviors by a trafficker. If the trafficker is the one to bring the person in, they might be dominant or speak for their victim. They might refuse to leave the victim alone. It looks a lot like domestic violence. It might be a parent or an exploiter or a friend or an older boyfriend that brings the person in. There might be multiple girls, females, or multiple children with one adult. The child, you want to try to get them alone, and you might to do any questioning. If the child presents alone, they might give you false information. Don't expect to get an honest ID out of the person, but you want to clarify the role. Who are you? Are you the parent? Are you the friend? Are you the uncle? Are you the boyfriend? Kind of clarify the role of the person who's bringing the victim in, and ask for identification. I know in the retail health center that I worked in, we did not ask for identification, for photo identification, if the person was paying cash. We only asked for the photo identification if the person was paying with a credit card or if we were processing insurance. And so I would encourage you to ask for identification, even if it's not accurate on the license. At least you have a photograph of what the person looks like, whether it's the victim or the trafficker. Also, if it is an out-of-state identification, that might prompt more questions. How did you get here? How long have you been here? If it's a child, where do you go to school? You might offer some common landmarks. I went to the waterfront this weekend. Where did you go this weekend? Those kind of things. And if you notice that there's been a lot of movement, a lot of from one state to another, one area of the county to another, or they really don't know where they are, they really don't know their landmarks, or they're new to town, those are all kind of red flags. But just know that the adult often is going to accompany a child. They're going to pay in cash, and it might not be the parent. The parent also might bring in their own child, and they might not know that they're being victimized. So don't assume if there's a parent and there's a child and you're really suspecting it that parent knows what's going on. But I like to just ask a lot of questions, like just kind of friendly questions. What did you do this weekend? Where did you go to school? Where do you like to hang out? What mall do you like to go to? Who goes with you? Those kind of questions. Observation is really going to get you far. There's no clinically validated screening tool for human trafficking, but there's different ways to recognize victims, whether it's through presentation or observation or the language that's used or physical findings like tattoos, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But just looking and being really observant. If they're accompanied, like I said, if they don't let the person speak, if there's inconsistent stories, or if the story just doesn't seemingly seem truthful, if they have neglected health care needs, if there's lack of control, if there's excess amount of cash. A good giveaway is if there's hotel room keys. If someone goes to reach into their pocket and they pull out a bunch of hotel room keys, because hotels are often used for human sex trafficking, that would be a good giveaway. If there's ever history of runaway or homelessness, or if all of a sudden, if you notice that the person has a lot of trendy jewelry and a lot of trendy clothes and it doesn't look like it's supported by the family's financial situation, that might be a key. If there's a female and she comes in and she asks for pregnancy tests, if she's really concerned about being pregnant and she's with the guy, that might be another heads up. If there's cell phones that are that multiple cell phones or multiple people living in the house, or if it looks like they're lying about their age, those are all reasons to be concerned. So now we're going to talk about physical exam. And when we do a physical exam, if we're looking to assess a patient, we want to ask their permission to touch them. If they are a victim of human trafficking, you should realize that they've probably had all of their own identity stripped from them, and they've lost all control over what they can do with their body. They're being sold on a very frequent basis, and they feel like they have no control. So just simple thing like asking, is it okay? I would like to look in your ears. Is it okay if I look in your ears? I would like to look in your mouth. Would it be okay if I looked in your mouth? Kind of give them as much control as you can. Remember to be compassionate and remember to honor them in their healing. And so here you're going to ask about physical injuries. You want to ask, have you ever broken a bone? Have you ever had a tooth knocked out? You want to look for signs and symptoms. Have you ever lost consciousness? Have you ever been struck? If someone comes in with an injury, were you struck or did you fall? Can you tell me more about that? That's a really good tool to get someone to answer, and it's open-ended. Can you tell me more about that? And then they'll say, oh, well, this happened. Can you tell me more about that? Instead of leading them into a situation. Do you feel like your memory is not as good as it now as it used to be? That might be something that you ask. Was there ever an investigation? If the person was hurt, did you seek medical care? And those are all good questions if there was an injury, but there's not always going to be injury. Just really good documentation. If they come in complaining of a sore throat, they come in complaining of an ear, they come in complaining of a UTI, really, really, really good documentation. We always say, if you have a camera taking photographs, if not, then just really good documentation about the skin findings, measure malnutrition, untreated medical conditions, tattoos, inappropriate clothing, how they're dressed, what their affect is, their behavior, if they're talkative, if they're engaged, if they're not. If you can, try to separate. You want to be able to explain the steps of what you're going to do to them before, and you want to monitor for signs of distress. And if there is a second person in your clinic, a second healthcare provider, it's good if you have a chaperone. You want to make sure, safety first, safety first. Make sure you exclude the suspected trafficker. So you want to have that person alone, that victim alone. If you cannot get the victim alone, I would not go into the questioning. I would certainly do my physical assessment, but I would not go into the questioning. And I would explain the results of your exam. Of course, you're going to want to do what's within the scope of practice. So things like pregnancy testing and sexually transmitted infections and providing prophylaxis, all of that does not pertain to retail health centers. It does pertain to the emergency room. So if you have someone who comes in and they complain of a lot of vaginal symptoms, I understand we don't do vaginal exams in retail health centers, but you still can go through your history and you still can go through the limited exam. Even if you're going to refer that person on, you can still document what you found before you refer that person on. And you can also get a heads up to whatever the institution is that you're going to be referring to. These are some examples of trafficker tattoos. Tattoos are very common in victims who are being trafficked. And so barcodes, like you see up on the upper left and the upper right, they're so common that I put a variety of them there. Often people who are being trafficked, they'll have something that identifies the trafficker. So here you see Suave. That might have been the name of the trafficker. Here you see JJ on a neck. They're usually on the neck, on the chest. Here's one on the inside of the lip. It says Ricky. So often people who are being trafficked, they will all have a similar tattoo. If a trafficker has, let's say, 10 people, they might have, all of their people might have the same tattoo. Daddy is very common, Big Daddy, Big Man, those kind of things that kind of inflate the ego. But just know that I would be very suspicious if I saw tattoos. Can you tell me more about that? When did you get that? Oh, does anyone else know that you know? And if they start like kind of shaming it and they want to cover it up, that's not usually a good sign. So these are, like I said, safety first. If you can, separate them. If the person doesn't speak English, you want to use a trusted interpreter, not the trafficker, not a family member. We all most likely in retail health setting have phone lines that we can use. And so with this, we want to look at the stigma and the labeling. And of course, we're going to respect HIPAA guidelines. But even in the retail health setting, we can begin to think about a follow-up appointment. So if you see someone and you suspect trafficking, but you're not ready to refer, one thing you might do is kind of guide it. If the person has an issue, like if they have a strep throat or if they have a UTI, I'd like to see you back in 3 days at this time with me or with whatever provider it's going to be so that I can recheck you, because this can become a lot worse. Or I'm not completely confident, I'm going to have to send your urine off for a test, I'm going to have to send your throat culture off for a test, but I need you to come back in 3 days. And that often works if you do it according to health needs. Like I said, there's a lot of power and there's a lot of control, so you really just have to be careful with the way that you phrase things, and remember safety first. This is a whole list of concerns and questions to ask adults. I'm not going to go over all of them with you, but I know that when I entered into forensics and when I entered into this field, it was really difficult for me to have those open-ended conversations. It was hard for me to figure out what to say or how to say it, so I listed a bunch of questions for adults and then for children too. How do you get money to buy food and clothing? When was the last time you saw your parents? If they come in with a friend, if they come in with a boyfriend, has anyone ever given you anything? Have you ever been given money to have sex? Has anyone ever taken pictures of you? Did those pictures end up online? Have you ever seen pictures of yourself online? Do you ever work in a club? Those are kind of ways to ask, rather than saying, are you a prostitute? Or are you being trafficked? These are kind of ways to open up those. And you'd be really surprised if you sound like you know what you're talking about, and some of these questions will help you with that, then you'd be really surprised how comfortable people will get and how much information you can get out of them to help them get to safety. So reporting, that is the next question. You don't have to know for sure that the patient that you're taking care of is being trafficked. You could just have a suspicion. And you're of course going to want to report according to your institution's guidelines. National Human Trafficking Resource Center is a fantastic resource. 1-888-373-7888 for assistance. They will guide you through what to do. If it's a child, you can call Child Protective Services, and they will link up with the Human Trafficking Task Force, and they will link up with law enforcement. You can contact law enforcement if you have a question. You can contact the Polaris Project, which I'll have resources for. If you know that you have a local human trafficking, like here in Louisville, Kentucky, we have Catholic Charities. Marissa Castellanos is the fantastic resource, the most knowledgeable person on human trafficking that I know here in Kentucky. So you can research your local law enforcement officers, your local resources. You should become familiar, and you can participate obviously in this training and in other trainings to know what the resources are in your areas. I don't know of a retail health center right now that has a protocol on what to do if you find a victim of human trafficking, but certainly going back to your organization and asking your supervisor what you should do, that is what I would recommend. These are community resources. They should be able to give you direction on ask questions, even if you think that you might have someone, even if it's not a safe situation for you to refer that person, you can give the National Resource Hotline or the National Resource Center information about tattoos or what the person looked like, or if you got ID, or just even demographics or what you were concerned about. And then the next place that person goes, it might be in a Walmart, it might be in a grocery store, it might be in a park. If someone else sees something and they give a similar description, you can kind of track those people to try to hopefully get that victim identified and removed from the system, because it is a horrible, horrible crime. So the next slide we have here is the Polaris Project. That's where I got those maps from. It is a fantastic website. They have all kinds of training on their website. They have policy, statistics. That's their website is listed there, along with the 24/7 hotline. Shared Hope International, the National Children's Advocacy Center if it is a child, but if it's adult, I would go to Polaris Project or Shared Hope, and that's about it. Since I'm not able to take questions at this time, I would ask that you can email me, erica.lemberger@chatham.edu. Please complete the post test. This is the link to the post test, the one that you would take after the survey if you didn't take the pre-test. but you would like to take the post-test, it's okay to take the post-test without the pre-test. That's okay. But I would please, please, please highly recommend that you take the post-test because it is part of my Doctorate of Nursing Practice project. And I'd like to thank you for taking your time to learn about this important issue. And if there's any way that I can help or if there's any questions that you have, please feel free to email me. And I wish you a good day. Thank you.